what's happening in Britain a week out from the general election? This is going to be a very consequential general election. I think there are three key points about this election which actually have global implications. The first thing is we are going to see the election of a strong Labour government, most likely with a big majority. The second thing is we are going to see the implosion of the British Conservative Party, which has governed the country since 2010. And the third thing we're going to see is the re-rise, the return of Nigel Farage and his new Reform Party. And I just wanted to say a few things about each of those developments because the root cause of all of this might not be fully appreciated, or at least what I think the root cause of this might not be fully appreciated outside of the UK. Beginning with the Labour Party, one of the most remarkable political feats that has been accomplished in British history has been Keir Starmer taking a party that in 2019 under Jeremy Corbyn experienced its worst defeat since 1935 to a party that is now on the cusp of winning a bigger majority than it won in 1997. That is an enormous political achievement for any politician, whether you are on the left or the right. We are either heading into an enormous Labour majority, which the latest polling suggests could be as high as 300, or we are heading into the biggest error in the history of the polling industry, in which case the pollsters should pack up and go home and it will be a very embarrassing night. Let's assume the polls are right. We're heading into a Labour majority of somewhere between 200 and 300 seats. Labour will re-emerge as a dominant force in Scotland. The SNP will be weaker. There will no longer be a push for Scottish independence. Labour will become an even stronger force in Wales, in London, the big cities, the university towns, and it will win every single seat back in the working class red wall, in the seats that Boris Johnson won in 2019. Labour, in other words, will emerge as really the only dominant one-nation party in British politics. The Conservatives, which are forecast to fall as low as 100 seats or lower, which would be unthinkable. Some of the more technical MRP polls over the last week have the Conservatives on 50 seats, which I think would be astonishing if that is true. But the Conservatives will be forced to retreat into the southeast and the East Anglia. They will no longer have a single MP in Northern England. Most of the people who are left in the Conservative Parliamentary Party will be Oxbridge educated, will be Southern, and will be more moderate, liberal, or what we would call one-nation Tories from the moderate wing of the party. So you might then expect there is mass public enthusiasm for the Labour Party, yet there is none. The Labour Party will win this election because of the old saying that opposition parties don't win elections, governments lose elections. And the reason the Labour Party is going to enjoy this historic swing is not because the British public are particularly enthusiastic about this Labour government, and is not because the British public are enthusiastic about Keir Starmer, because his leadership ratings are fairly flat. Keir Starmer is on +10 in the leadership ratings. In 1997, Tony Blair was +50. Okay, so Keir Starmer is a nice guy who's doing enough to win the election. But on the issue of policy, there are no real policies that are being offered by the Labour Party that are inspiring mass public enthusiasm. It is simply the fact that they are not the Tories. There is really no big difference between Labour and the Conservative Party on policy anyway. Ever since Brexit, what we have got is a new consensus between left and right that is big state, big tax, big regulation, big debt, and big immigration. There is no discernible difference between the two parties on those issues. Essentially, both of them are committed to that consensus. So Labour are profiting because there is a rejection of 14 years of Conservative government. But it is more than that. if you look at who is responsible for the Conservative Party's decline, it is the 2019 Conservative Party voters, all of the people who rallied behind Boris Johnson, who are now running away from the Conservative Party. Only 37% of those voters are planning to vote Conservative next week. Only 37% who voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. So where have they gone? 20% have gone to the Labour Party, 28% have gone to Nigel Farage and Reform, and the rest are saying they're not going to vote at all. Now, why have they left the Conservative Party? Because of two issues. The first, they want to stop the small boats and the illegal migration invasion on the southern border, and they no longer believe the Conservative Party can do that. And number two, they want to lower the overall level of legal immigration into Britain. And I've surveyed all of the 2019 Conservative Party voters and asked them, why are you leaving? And those are the top two issues, okay? But underneath that is a deeper point. They're leaving because they were lied to. That is what is happening. Boris Johnson lied to the British people. The Conservatives lied to the British people. They said, if you vote Conservative in 2019, we will lower the overall numbers. We will lower the overall numbers of migrants coming into Britain. We will level up the left behind regions. We will invest in areas outside of London that have been left behind. We will control the borders, and we will give you a self-governing, independent, sovereign nation state. What happened over the next 5 years is the opposite of what Boris Johnson promised. Net migration went from 330,000 at the time of the Brexit referendum, meaning 330,000 more people coming into the UK than leaving every year. It went from 330,000 to 700,000. Over the last 3 years in Britain, 4 million people entered the country, which is the largest sustained increase in immigration in our entire history. And of those 4 million people who have come into the country, 15%, 1/5, came on a high-skilled working visa. Okay, so when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he said, I'm going to give you less migration, and I'm going to give you a high-skill, Australia-based point system. But what he actually gave the country was masses of low-skill migration, much of which actually is not contributing to the economy at all. So the relatives of workers, the relatives of students, asylum seekers, illegal migrants, and so forth. This is why so many 2019 Conservatives have not just given up on politics by saying they're not going to vote at all, but it is why we are now dealing with the third factor, which is the return of Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, who are currently, as of this morning, averaging 18% in the opinion polls. Nigel Farage has announced he's standing in the seat of Clacton in Essex. He will win that seat. He will become a member of Parliament for the 8th time of trying, but he will do that because of his support among 2019 Conservative Party voters who are saying, we no longer trust the Conservative Party. Okay, so nearly 10 years on from the vote for Brexit in 2016, what have we really learned? We've learned that the political class have no interest in giving Brexit voters what they were asking for, which is lower migration, control over the borders, and slower demographic and cultural change. We've learned that Nigel Farage is as strong as he was in 2016. In fact, I was campaigning, watching him campaigning in Clacton last week. He's a better campaigner now in many respects than he was in 2016. He feels that he's much more in tune with the country, and the political class is much weaker than it was during the David Cameron, Ed Miliband era. And he can sense what's going to happen next week. So what they are saying is they want to win between 1 and 3 seats, but they want to win 5 or 6 million votes, and they want to win somewhere between 50 and 150 second places. And if you look at the areas where Reform will finish second, of the 100 seats where they're forecast to have their best performance, 75 will be in Labour-held seats. So there's a two-stage strategy that Farage is following. Stage one is destroy the Tories next week. Ensure that the current model of conservatism, a liberal Tory patrician brand of conservatism that has not really delivered on what it promised, can no longer be a viable model of conservatism. That's stage one. Stage two is then attack a Labour government for presiding over further increases in legal immigration, illegal migration, woke ideology, and reshaping the constitution of the United Kingdom around a pro-Labour settlement, giving votes to 16-year-olds, scrapping the House of Lords, rewiring the system around a social democratic politics. So that is Farage's longer-term strategy, and he's been very explicit in saying he wants to do this over 5 years. This is not just about what happens next Wednesday, this is a 5-year strategy. So that is what is unfolding in British politics, but if I can just take 2 minutes and just make a couple of deeper points about what is happening. So this talk is called The Crisis of Conservatism, because that is exactly what it is. What you are going to see next week is the collapse of a party that philosophically, ideologically, electorally, no longer knows what it is. It no longer knows what it is. Is it a northern party or a southern party? Is it an urban party or a rural party? Is it a party for the working class or a party for the middle class? Is it a party for the Brexiteers or a party for the Remainers? Is it a socially liberal party or a culturally conservative party? And I suspect many Czechs listening to me talk about the centre-right might be thinking there are some parallels with Czech politics or with certain parties here. But that's why what the Conservatives are heading into is a full-blown identity crisis. Because in the aftermath of Brexit, as I've said for much of the last 8 years, they had a unique opportunity to completely realign the country around a new post-Brexit conservative politics, a bit like Donald Trump has done with the Republicans, and arguably a bit like Marine Le Pen and National Rally are doing in France. The British Tories refused to do that because the Tory elite class leans much further to the cultural left than the voters they won over in the aftermath of Brexit. They didn't want to lean into Northern England. They didn't want to lean into immigration skepticism. They didn't want to relocate from the southeast. They didn't really want to intervene to ensure that our public institutions, our schools and universities were stripping out woke ideology and were removing what have become overtly political government departments. They didn't want to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion. They didn't want to deal with what they say are culture wars, when actually, when you're talking about the rights of women, the rights of children, our collective memory, and what we teach our children about our history and our identity, they are the most conservative things of all. But the British Conservative Party didn't want to get involved in those discussions because they viewed them as low-status discussions, as debates that were somehow beyond the pale, that were a bit toxic. And so now, as a consequence, they're being outflanked by Nigel Farage, who is saying, I will ban all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in every government department. He said he will have a patriotic curriculum in British schools where if we are teaching kids about slavery and imperialism in the West, then we will simultaneously teach them about slavery and imperialism in non-Western countries so that we have a balance. He is saying we'll have an immediate freeze on all non-essential mass migration that does not contribute to the National Health Service. And he's saying we will leave the European Convention on Human Rights and we will leave any international convention that allows us to control who comes in and out of the country illegally or legally. So on all of those issues, he is outflanking the Conservatives. So everything now is going to hinge this summer, assuming we have a Labour government with a big majority for the next 5 years, everything is now going to hinge on what happens with a prolonged, protracted, ideological civil war within the Conservative family. And there will be a civil war between establishment Tory Conservatives who want to go back to a David Cameron brand of conservatism that voters have already rejected through the Brexit referendum and the 2019 election. The Tory elite class will try and go back to the past because they are uncertain as to how they can navigate the future. And then there will be national conservatives who will say, well, if you look at what's going to happen in America in November, and if you look at what's just happened in Europe at the European Parliament elections, the future of conservatism is a conservatism that is willing to intervene in order to push back radical ideologies in the institutions, a conservatism that understands the immigration crisis is the biggest crisis of all facing Western nations, and is a conservatism that understands that sectarianism in politics, the rise of radical Islam in Western societies, is a challenge that we need to take very seriously, and we cannot simply say this is a low-status discussion. That civil war will be determined, the outcome of that will be determined by who becomes leader of the Conservative Party. Because Nigel Farage will represent national conservatives, and who the Conservative Parliamentary Party elect in the aftermath of their defeat will determine what direction that battle goes. And I'd like to tell you who will become the next Conservative Party leader. The reason I can't is because I think the defeat next week might be so heavy that an entire generation of potential leadership candidates might be about to lose their seats. Penny Mordaunt might lose her seat. Rishi Sunak potentially might lose his seat. Not that he'd be kept as leader, but a whole generation of conservatives are about to lose their seats. So the direction of travel is going to hinge on who becomes leader on the Conservative side, is also going to depend on how big that reform vote is for Nigel Farage. If he's elected, that's essentially all that matters for his revolt. But is it 5 million votes, or is it 6 million votes? Is it 7 million votes? That will also have a major impact. And just lastly, if you want to also think about this election through a lens that very few people are thinking about it through, but I think it's a useful one, what you also now have in British politics is a rejection of all of the established parties. Yes, Labour are doing very well in the polls, the Conservatives collapsing, but actually if this election is going to be remembered for anything, I think it will be remembered as the none of the above election, an election where a large number of voters are looking at Labour and the Conservatives and saying, actually, none of these parties have the answers to Britain's structural problems. Because that is true. Nobody is talking about what we're going to do with our lack of growth. What is the new growth strategy for Britain over the next 10 years? Nobody is talking about how we're going to bring down debt. Our debt to GDP ratio is 99%. 99%. Okay, nobody is talking about how we're going to revive productivity, how we're going to revive innovation. We have some discussion about net zero. Labour are going to spend 15 billion on a Green Deal, but we have no serious long-term economic strategy for Brexit Britain over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Nobody's being honest with voters about the state of the public finances. There's now an assumption that taxes are going to need to go up, because we cannot continue to afford the amount that we're spending on public services, but then at the same time we're not allowed to discuss radical changes to our economy and our society like Liz Truss tried to do, because much of the elite consensus cannot stomach the idea of radical political change. So as you can probably tell, I'm very pessimistic about the direction of British politics. I don't think Labour have the answers to Britain's problems, but I also don't think the Conservatives do. And by the way, I don't think Nigel Farage has the answers to Britain's problems. But I will say something for Nigel Farage. He is asking some of the right questions. How are we going to deal with the fact that Britain is forecast to have 6.5 million people come into the country over the next 12 years? That's the government's own estimate, 6.5 million people over the next 12 years. That's a population growth rate of 10%. No modern Western advanced country has ever gone through that growth rate in modern times. How are we going to deal with segregation within our communities? How are we going to deal with Islamist terrorism within Western economies, and how are we going to resolve the small boats crisis, which has brought 128,000 mainly young single men into Britain over the last 4 years alone, which the security services have said pose a fundamental security threat to the British people because of their links to Islamist extremism. So those are the questions that we should be debating and discussing within our mainstream political arena. The Labour and Conservative parties should be putting forward solutions to those problems, but they're not. So if you say, Matt, I don't understand, why is Nigel Farage back in British politics? That is why. Because again, nearly 10 years on from Brexit, we are not responding to the concerns that people have about their national community and about the place they call home. And it is a place that they want to be, where they want to feel secure, stable, and they don't want to have people coming in making them feel as though they no longer recognize that place they come from and that place they call home. So I'm sure there are some questions about the election. Perhaps I can get into some specific policies, and I'm aware that my colleague here, no doubt, has some points of disagreement and discussion, and we can take that into the conversation. But we are on the cusp next week of something very historic, and which will have an enormous impact on the direction of Britain before we even get to geopolitics in Israel and Russia and Ukraine. But it's going to be a seismic, historic election. So I hope you stay up and watch it with me on Wednesday evening, and we can watch it unfold. Thank you. Thank you for your presence.
Michael, do you have any questions? Do you have any comments, reflections? Do you want to offer your own perspective on that?
I will start with recollection. Today is what, 25th of June. That means that 8 years ago, on the 23rd of June 2016, we were sitting with a similar audience not far from here, following the referendum results, and we decided to, because we knew that the results would come in late, and it's later here than in London, right? So we decided to hold a vigil, and we lasted until I think 3 o'clock in the morning when the results came back from Leicester, I think, and one of our MEPs said, well, now we can go to sleep. I mean, Britain will stay, you know. It's so much for famous last words. And here we are 8 years later, and echoes of Brexit are still reverberating in British politics, and we are ahead of another historic election, and I wish I had more points of disagreements with what you said than I have, because it would provide for a more heated debate. But still, at the risk of playing the avocatus diaboli, it surely cannot be just about migration. The swing from Conservative to Labour is a major swing. The Reform Party will get 18%, you said, as compared to 31% for the National Front in France. So, in my mind, the swing is hardly explicable just by one factor, that of migration. Surely, because we assume, and I don't know whether you agree with me, that Labour will not do any better on migration than the Conservatives have done. So this is a bit counterintuitive. So my question would be, Matt, what are the other issues, maybe not so conspicuous, that make the voters change to Labour?
Well, I think if you look at the priorities for all British voters next week, number one is the cost of living crisis, number two is the National Health Service, and number three is immigration. Now, it's true, if you look across the West, all incumbents have been punished because of inflation, right? Over the last 2 or 3 years, most elections have seen changes in power that have followed inflation peaking. And that's consistent with what we'd expect from the literature. If elections are held within 2 or 3 years of inflation peaking, incumbents tend to get punished. In Britain, the National Health Service, which is the closest thing we have to a national religion, the NHS is, you know, a bizarre organization. If you've ever used it, you realize it's collapsing. If you haven't, you sort of think it's this mythical being that we all kind of live to worship. But the NHS is in dire straits, and that's a Labour issue. But the reason I zoomed in on immigration is because if you look at the recent by-elections we've had in Britain, the Labour vote itself is not actually going up that much. What's happening is the Conservative vote is collapsing. And the reason people are abandoning the Conservatives or defecting to Nigel Farage and Reform, the top two reasons are small boats and migration. So we have at the epicenter of this rebellion a very distinctive request from voters, which is, can you please slow this down? I don't want net migration at 700,000. I don't want the borders out of control. Can somebody fix this? Now, I agree with you, by the way. Under Labour, what's Labour said it's going to do? I mean, this is where it gets really interesting. You have 120,000 people in the UK who have arrived illegally. Okay, so they've come on the small boats. Labour has said they're going to process all of those people. They're not going to try and deport them. They're going to process them. So effectively, they're going to give an amnesty to 120,000 people. At the same time, they're going to overturn Rishi Sunak's Rwanda deal, which they say is not going to work, even though we've not tried it yet. They're also going to repeal the Illegal Migration Act, which Rishi Sunak brought in to basically allow us to detain and deport illegal migrants back to countries such as Albania and elsewhere. So within a month of the Labour government basically taking office, you're going to see wholesale changes in our immigration policy, which I would argue, and I accept not everybody will agree with me, but I would argue are basically the equivalent of putting some big neon lights on the White Cliffs of Dover and saying, come on in, it's a much more permissive environment, we're going to have a much softer approach to migration. So that's what I think is going to happen. Labour, for that reason, not just that reason, Labour's also not going to have much room for manoeuvre on the economy. We have very high levels of debt, very expensive debt. We have low growth. That means over the next 5 years, Labour is not going to be able to do anything dramatic on the economy. Taxes are going to have to go up. We have public spending cuts factored into the government budgets already of about £20 billion. So Labour is not going to be able to radically improve public services. For all of these reasons, what I'm saying is by Christmas, Labour will be a very unpopular government because there is no mass public enthusiasm for Labour. This isn't a party political point, it's just they won't be a very popular government. So we're going to be back in a way to where we are now with a lot of frustrated voters saying, look, everything is expensive. Food is expensive, my mortgage is expensive, my local council tax is expensive, the public services don't really work. My grandmother and my grandfather are trying to use a health service or social care. It's collapsing. And we've got record levels of migration. And you told us that mass migration would give us a better economy, but our growth rate is non-existent and our GDP per head is going backwards. We've got the worst GDP per head figures that we've had since the 1950s. Okay, so we don't have the political leadership and honesty that is required to actually negotiate these issues in a more mature way. If we did, then I think you would find a leader who could genuinely inspire public enthusiasm and support. But at the moment, neither party, neither Labour nor Conservatives, are being honest with voters.
Matt, could you elaborate a little bit what is Faragism? Do they really have any real agenda besides of stop the boats, and what does a typical Reform Party voter look like? What's his?
Well, we were talking just before the event, and I think there is an old-fashioned view of Farage, and then there is a view of what that movement is becoming now. The traditional view of Farage is he's not a serious person and he doesn't have serious ideas. If you think that, okay, I understand that, but if you go and look at the Reform Manifesto that has been released called A Contract with You, that is a very serious document. Whereas Nigel Farage, who I've known for 15 years, used to be a single-issue politician. Get out of the European Union. That was it. That's where it began and ended, was leave the EU. Now, there are pretty comprehensive policies to, yes, change the migration regime, but also to oppose radical woke progressivism, to remove regulation for small businesses, to lower taxation, to reform the National Health Service, to remove the lowest earners out of income tax altogether, so to raise the tax threshold to £20,000, to reduce overseas aid by 50%, to spend that money on public services, and to reshape the British economy and society around what we might call a principle of national preference. The idea that British people, British families, whether it's in the housing crisis, whether it's in the economy, whether it's with regard to migration, should be prioritized above people who are not from Britain. Now, that fundamentally is the promise that he's making to voters. He's also been very open in saying, you know, at the age, he's 60, which I think is still young in politics, but he's saying he now wants to build a movement that has a much broader coalition of people around it. Younger people, not just former conservatives, classical liberals, people who understand that left and right are no longer serving Britain meaningfully, and that we need to try and force the big parties to deliver a more responsive politics. So I think my last point would be, look, if there's one message from the last 20 years in British politics, it's never, ever underestimate Nigel Farage. Like, I understand for many people, you know, you see the YouTube videos and he's a comical character, but he has consistently outflanked the big parties, consistently, forced a referendum on EU membership, won the referendum on EU membership, became the first politician to win millions of votes in Labour areas, set the foundation for the political realignment in 2019, and is now back with a new party that's polling 18%. So only an idiot would say Nigel Farage will no longer have an impact on British politics. I suspect actually he is going to end up having an enormous impact over the next 5 years if he wins his seat in Clacton and ends up in Parliament.
Just one more very brief question. I just wanted to ask about his impact on politics, because in majority system, his ability to get real vote and real seats in Parliament is quite limited. So does he have a chance to have real impact even with just a couple of MPs?
If he ends up in the House of Commons, the reality is wherever Nigel goes, the media will follow. So what he needs to do over the next 6 months is build a party infrastructure. Somebody said to me last week in the Reform Party, they're building the plane while they're flying. You know, it's a new party, they don't have an organization. They need to build a presence in the House of Commons. I mean, he's going to be faced with a lot of things he's never done before. He's going to need a serious office in Westminster. He's going to need to deal with the everyday boring things that come with being an MP, dealing with constituency business, while maintaining a national profile and presumably helping Donald Trump in November with his election in the United States. at the same time as broadening out his message, encouraging Conservative MPs to defect to reform, attracting money. Since launching their campaign 4 weeks ago, they've raised £4 million from ordinary members of the public, and he's going to need to try and provide people with a sense of where he wants to take British politics and British conservatism over the next 5 years. Now, I don't think, as I say, Farage can answer all of those problems. I think, for example, his comments on Ukraine, even though they were taken out of context, I don't think that was necessarily the best move for somebody who's trying to recruit Conservatives during the election campaign. So, you know, he still needs, he's prone to mistakes, let's put it that way. But I think if you get the right people around that movement, then I think it could seriously give the Conservatives a run for its money. So I'll just leave you with one scenario. Just imagine this. Imagine next Thursday you wake up and the Conservatives are on 100 to 150 seats, okay, which is a historic low. And then imagine in response to that, they elect as leader somebody like Penny Mordaunt, Tom Tugendhat, somebody from the more liberal, moderate wing of the party, and they say, well, we lost the election because of Brexit, because of the Rwanda plan, because of Suella Braverman, because we were too right-wing, which I could see the Conservatives doing. So let's say they do that. They become more of a Southern party, an Oxbridge party, a liberal party. If that happens, Nigel Farage will never have had as big an opening in British politics as he would have then, because he would be able to completely dominate the Conservative space. Now, whether he's shrewd and sophisticated enough to do that, that's an open question. We'll all have to watch and see if he can do that. But if the Conservatives make a miscalculation this summer, we could legitimately be witnessing the strange death of the Conservative Party.
So by miscalculation, you meant electing the wrong leader, right?
Yeah.
And okay, I was about to ask a similar question. I mean, does he have a chance to win any other seats but Cleveland?
Maybe 2 or 3. I mean, there might be a couple of surprises. Yeah, Great Yarmouth, maybe Boston and Skegness, possibly.
And he occupies the conservative, right conservative space. What do you think are the chances of this becoming a political wave and the chance of another early election? You said 5 years. I mean,
well, if we have a big Labour majority, we won't have another election until 2029. And by that time, the country will look very different to how it looks today. But what we will see between now and then are a series of by-elections, local elections. Of course, one irony of Brexit is we no longer have European Parliament elections, so in some ways it's closed down our politics to alternatives. But we will see through those elections Farage and Reform continuously trying to finish ahead of the Conservatives. And, you know, ask yourself one question. Of all the Conservative MPs who are going to lose their seats next week, and there will be hundreds, what are they going to do with their lives? Do they just give up on politics and they say, okay, that's it, I've had my time? Or will they defect to Reform? We don't know. What about former cabinet ministers like Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch? What if the Conservatives choose a liberal leader in the summer? Where does the right-wing flank of what remains of the Conservative Party go? Those are all open questions that will be resolved over the next 6 months.
Another point that we briefly discussed before we went here, you said that people were deserting the Conservative Party because the 2019 Conservatives, the Boris Johnson Conservatives, lied to them about things that they would do. But aren't they also deserting because Boris is no longer there? And I'm driving at the book we briefly discussed of Nadine Dorris about the removal of Boris Johnson from the Conservative Party as a sort of a conspiracy, a plot to assassinate the leader. So what is your take on that?
Well, the first thing to say is there was a plot to remove Boris Johnson. There was a concerted effort by the Conservative Parliamentary Party to get rid of Boris Johnson because they hated everything he stood for. So, you know, that is true, and it was partly supported by the media class. But anyway, look, Boris Johnson will not save the Conservative Party. One of the jokes in Westminster is Boris Johnson was the third Prime Minister to be brought down by Boris Johnson because he was so incompetent. After helping to bring down David Cameron and Theresa May, he then brought himself down. But he won't save the Conservative Party for a number of reasons. One is Boris Johnson, everybody can now see, was not a Conservative. Boris Johnson was a Bohemian Liberal. In fact, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage have had this week, they've had a very visible argument. Boris Johnson blamed Nigel Farage for his comments about Ukraine, and he said, you know, Farage is a Putin apologist for saying that the West had encouraged Putin by expanding, eastwards. At which point Nigel Farage pointed out that Boris Johnson had said exactly the same thing about the EU enlargement in the 2010s, but also made another point, which was Boris Johnson was the person who liberalized the entire immigration system. And if you look at Boris Johnson's ratings today, he is still a very, very toxic politician, much more so than he was in 2019. He's not only alienated liberals by being incompetent and presiding over Partygate, but he's also alienated conservatives who realize that once you get past the boosterism and the funny haircut, Boris Johnson actually isn't really one of them. This is something not many people know. Boris Johnson even removed the requirement for British companies to advertise jobs in Britain before they advertise jobs in other countries. Yeah, so this is something a conservative doesn't do. He liberalized the entire migration regime. He presided over something called the graduate visa program, which has been a complete disaster because it allowed students to bring in hundreds of thousands of relatives, most of whom then went to work in the low-skilled gig economy, and in turn that basically has been driving up rents and house prices across the country, which even the Migration Advisory Committee, which is a liberal think tank, basically concedes. So Boris Johnson really laid a foundation for many of the problems we're now experiencing. I don't think Boris, or the return of Boris, he'd have to win a seat. So he'd have to come back, he'd have to impress the Conservative Party, he'd have to win a constituency, he'd then have to convince MPs to make him leader again. I mean, this is a 5 to 10 year project. Even if he were to get all of that, I still don't think he is anywhere near the politician he was in 2019.
All right. Well, you know, as a father of a girl who's studying in London, I have some sympathies for the student program, but
I know I'm a supporter of international students, but where I say I don't think your daughter should be permitted to bring relatives full-time into the UK to work in the gig economy. I think that is crazy, and that's exactly what Boris Johnson did.
Matt, I was not entirely serious there.
Oh,
but
okay, well, I do like international students. I just want to.
Okay, but at the risk of stretching the comparison too far, I remember another British politician who was widely condemned as being incompetent, at least in his role as the First Lord of Admiralty during the Dardanelles disaster, and he was not a true conservative, he was a liberal. For a time he even went Whig, right? And yet he came back to be remembered. So I wouldn't entirely, it's not that I'm pushing or promoting Boris, but I wouldn't entirely discount him just just yet.
From my point of view, the Conservative Party is one of the most successful political parties in democratic world, and they were able to reinvent themselves for so many times. You know, they survived 20 years in opposition after Cornwallis. They survived 13 years of opposition in the late 90s and beginning of the 21st century. So is there any chance for them to reinvent themselves, to revive some conservative movement without Nigel Farage?
I was listening to a very prominent conservative politician the other day, Hammond, who was Chancellor with Theresa May, Philip Hammond. And he said, under no circumstances should Nigel Farage ever be allowed back into the Conservative Party, because he was a member in the 1980s. And they said, under no circumstances should the Conservative Party ever do business with somebody like Nigel Farage. Now, I would say in response to that, well, kiss the Conservative Party goodbye, because national conservatism is closer to the public mood than establishment, liberal, Tory, patrician conservatism. And what's happened is the Tory elite class still think they're living in 2015, or they still think they're living in 1988. They haven't understood, I think, how the tectonic plates of politics are now moving. And the issues that they perceive to be low-status issues, or issues that, to be frank, they often feel are beneath them, you know, what they deride as culture war issues, or migration, or demographic change, the nation, they haven't understood how important those issues are becoming to voters. Because I think, my personal politics, I genuinely think we are now rapidly approaching a civilizational moment in not just Britain, but across much of the West. And by that, I mean a moment whereby the things that make us and us, our collective history, our values, our way of life, our shared identity, are now coming under strain and are beginning to fragment. And many people can sense that politics is no longer about transactional policy, but is about who is going to respond to this civilizational moment that we are at, as countries that need to be held together by a common sense of what it is that makes us and us. And the Tory elite class haven't understood that. You know, you can see that because they talk endlessly about let's cut taxes. Like that's the answer to everything, is let's cut taxes. And voters, firstly, only a third of British voters want to cut taxes because they're worried about what that would mean for public services. But more fundamentally, they don't just want a kind of stripped down fiscal conservatism. They genuinely want somebody to actually take control of the national community, preserve it, protect it, and have something that they can pass down to their children and grandchildren. Because fundamentally, if you're not doing that as a Conservative Party, then what are you doing?
Yeah, well, I was wondering what you meant by mentioning similarities to the Czech political landscape. Now I get it. Yeah,
that's exactly my question.
Okay. So, what do you think are the chances of, you know, there might be Conservatives who will lose their seats in Westminster, deserting to reform, but is there any chance or anyone within the Conservative Party who would think more in terms of realignment or you know, a broader coalition with
Farage, yeah. I mean, so if you had, let's say you have a scenario with Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman or Robert Jenrick, people like that becoming leader. Again, you know, it's impossible to predict who the next leader will be because there'll be about 15 people who will put themselves forward after the election. Many people will lose their seats, and it may be that there are lots of unknown figures who are suddenly stepping forward to try and become leader. Let's say somebody from the right of the party becomes leader. They then say, okay, I'm going to open the door to Nigel Farage and reform because we're all part of one Conservative family and we need to be together as part of this family. The next question then is, what is Nigel Farage's price for accepting that invitation? And I suspect that would be much more than what people often think. They wrongly think the only thing Nigel wants is a seat in the House of Lords. That is not really his guiding motivation, and you wouldn't want to be in the Lords anyway, given that Labour are about to, replace the House of Lords with, God knows what. His request or demand will be policy-based. It would be, reshaping the Conservative manifesto around the issues that he cares about. It would certainly be some kind of chair seat around the cabinet. But, it would have to be something very substantive because instinctively, Farage's view is anti-Tory. To join the Tories, in a way, undermines everything Nigel Farage is about. So it would have to be a credible offer, a serious offer from somebody he respects, and it'd have to be a longer term, it would have to be part of a longer term plan to realign the Conservatives. And if he's simply not driven by personal gain in the way that many people think he is. If he was, he wouldn't be standing to become an MP, on a salary of £65,000 a year. I'm sure he could go to America and, make a lot more money doing whatever he wants to do with Trump.
Yeah, or doing TV. One thing, if the Labour were really serious about abolishing the House of Lords, what would be the constitutional obstacles to that? Could you walk us through it?
Well, Gordon Brown has laid out his constitutional proposals, votes for 16, more devolution, House of Lords being replaced by a kind of like a chamber of experts, kind of appointed political people drawn from business, different sectors of the economy. There's been some discussion maybe having an element of sort of a citizens' assembly type thing in there. What Labour fundamentally want to do is reshape the Westminster model of politics. They don't want power to be hoarded at the centre. They want more devolution for Scotland, Wales and the regions. They also want more power to be sent upwards and sideways to unelected quangos, to technocrats, to bureaucrats. And that, again, obviously is a cause for concern if you are a Democrat or if you want to learn from the lessons of Brexit that actually people want more power invested in them, not in unelected autocratic institutions. That's essentially what they're talking about, alongside votes for 16, maybe votes for EU nationals. So these are pretty sweeping changes. And the underlying point here is Labour historically have always been better at using power to reshape the system. The Conservatives, with an 80-seat majority, didn't do anything to reshape the system. They didn't even tinker with the new Labour legislative legacy. Labour already have big plans to rewire the Constitution so that it leans fundamentally in a social democratic direction. Now, if the polls are wrong, by the way, just to cover myself in case they are, but if the polls are wrong next week and we have a hung parliament, and actually instead of a Labour majority, you find yourself looking at a screen with a Labour-led minority government, some kind of coalition-type arrangement, confidence and supply, then we're into the territory of potentially talking about electoral reform or a move to proportional representation, which the Liberal Democrats want, which the SNP would support, which the Greens want, which Nigel Farage wants, and that might be an opening to a discussion about finally changing the first past the post system and having a more European style arrangement. I don't know if that would necessarily happen, but there is appetite for that debate to happen, particularly after 2015, where, you know, Farage won 4 million votes and got 1 seat.
Well, how odd that would be as one of the consequences of Brexit. All right, technical point here. Is everybody familiar with the concept of quangos? Maybe could you...
So Quango is, let's say I decided to set up an organization with everybody in this room and we will be responsible for net zero policy, and nobody in this room is actually elected by ordinary people, but we suddenly wield an enormous amount of power and we belong to the expert class and we are informing government and lobbying government based on, you know, what we decide in this room. That's a quango. Now, quangos, there are 70 or 80 quangos now within British politics. So they wield considerable amount of power, but they have no democratic mandate beyond the fact that members of those organizations are appointed typically by the government of the day.
Quango means quasi non-government organization. You know, it's a front for a non-government organization, but it's not really independent of the government. And I think we have some instances in continental Europe as well of that. So shall we go for Q&As now?
May I still have my last question, please?
Katerino, of course you can. Of course you can.
I just want a brief answer because you already talked about it. What should be the lessons learned of Tories' downfall for, let's say, some Central European country and its political parties? What's it like the strongest message we should, or someone should address them?
I can only say this through the prism of, you know, when I gave a presentation to Boris Johnson, you have to understand who voted for you and why they voted for you. And if the elite class become disconnected from the people who have put that class into power, voters will abandon you. I mean, this is not rocket science, right? This is not a complex problem to solve. The people who voted for the Conservatives at the last election wanted a number of things that the Conservatives promised them. The Conservatives did not deliver on those things and actively betrayed those voters. The Conservatives are now being punished as a consequence of that betrayal. Like, it's that simple. Like, and you can listen to, you know, Rory Stewart and George Osborne and David Cameron, and they can tell you, oh, the real reason that we're suffering is because of Brexit and all of this stuff. Like, that's nonsense. That's liberal centrists telling themselves what liberal centrists want to hear. The real reason is because they won this unique coalition that could have given them 10 years in power. They could have given them an enormous, prolonged period of power, and all they had to do was actually deliver on the things that they promised those voters. And it still would have been difficult with inflation, cost of living. It would have been a hard thing to do, but I think Boris Johnson could have been campaigning now saying, look, I've maintained net migration at 250,000. It's not ideal, we're still getting it lower, but things are moving in the right direction. I've prioritized high-skill migration policy. I've focused as much as I can on sending institutions and power outside of London to the regions. I'm in negotiations with the European Convention on Human Rights, and I'm trying to reform our membership, if not leave, so we can control the borders. I have commissioned a full-blown reform of what we're teaching children about gender, race, and our history in schools. And I understand that you care about this because it's about our civilization and the future of our country. I mean, that Boris Johnson now would, I suspect, be heading for an election win, but with a small majority. You know, nothing like an 80-seat majority, but he'd be competitive. Instead, we've got what we've got, you know, which is Rishi Sunak, who doesn't have a mandate, presiding over no real program of substance. And this is like, if Rishi Sunak was here, this is the question I would ask him, which is like, what was all of this for? You campaigned to get rid of Boris Johnson. You campaigned to get rid of Liz Truss. You then got appointed prime minister with no public mandate. And the only thing that he's delivered, okay, he'll say, well, I reduced inflation. Well, that actually wasn't him, that was the Bank of England. I introduced a ban on smoking. I reformed how kids are evaluated when they do their exams. I cancelled a high-speed rail line. Like, I'm struggling. I can't think of what Rishi Sunak has done. And then you look at these people and you think, well, you've destroyed so much to get where you are, but there's nothing to show for it. And when you do then campaign, you go to a D-Day anniversary and you leave halfway through. I don't understand why he's making these decisions unless he really is completely disconnected from the reality in which ordinary voters live. There's no authenticity to Rishi Sunak. His campaign is overtly technocratic and managerial. If you said to me, what does Rishi Sunak believe? I couldn't tell you. I think at best he's an average business secretary. He's certainly not a prime minister. He's not a prime minister of any standing. And the people who are advising him, I think, are very disconnected with the people who voted for the Conservatives in 2019. And if I were Boris Johnson, I would be enjoying this spectacle, watching it unfold. But if I was a 2019 Conservative Party voter, I would be utterly disillusioned with the direction of travel.
Yeah, well, you know, we still act like he's there, but maybe he's already left, you know. It's...
Well, the rumor in Westminster, they say, you know, in Westminster they say he already is planning to move to California in the autumn.
I've had that rumor
so who
too.
knows? Maybe he has gone.
Okay, so now this is a democratic audience. Questions?
Thank you very much for the discussion and for the insights. I have one really question that was not mentioned here about the media landscape and about the GB News in that sense. Did these new outlets, media outlets, help to amplify the Reform UK and Farage himself? And what will be the role of media in these elections? It always played a huge role. So thank you very much.
Well, there's no doubt GB News helped Nigel Farage maintain his brand. His show at 7 p.m. Weeknights was one of the most watched shows in the 7 p.m. slot. It was one of the shows that really has kept GB News going. I don't know of any evidence showing that that's why Reform are doing as well as they are. I know that GB News are being very balanced in their coverage of the election because they are understandably anxious about what a Labour government will mean in terms of regulation of new media. And I think that's a legitimate concern. They are worried that conservative media will face much greater scrutiny under a Labour government. Interestingly, there was a survey last week which showed that of all GB News viewers, the most popular choice was Labour, followed by the Reform Party. So it might be worth considering that. And lastly, what you're seeing in Britain, like other countries, is the fragmentation of the media landscape. So it's not just GB News, there's Talk TV, there's YouTube shows, there's Substacks, podcasts. So you're seeing a fragmentation of the media landscape. And legacy media, by which I mean BBC mainly, has been struggling. The flagship programs like Radio 4 Today in the morning have lost 3.5 million listeners since Brexit. There is an ongoing debate about the BBC and whether it is neutral and independent or whether it has a sort of soft left bias. But on balance, no, I think the fragmentation of the media landscape is actually probably a good thing because clearly previously people were not feeling represented in the public conversation.
You follow the polling. What is the age cohorts distribution in the polling this time as compared, and I'm especially interested in Farage, as compared to 2015.
Yeah, so what's interesting is his support has got a little bit younger, partly because he's been on these big television shows, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, his brand is big, he was one of the first politicians to invest in TikTok, and he's very, very active on social media. There are more, if you look at the YouGov polling, currently more 18 to 24-year-old Zoomers from Gen Z are planning to vote Reform than Conservative. Which again speaks to this point that there's something going on with reform that the Conservatives haven't quite yet understood. Having said that, about 80% of young 18 to 24-year-olds in Britain are planning to vote for the left combined, so the liberal left, the cultural left, Labour, Lib Dem, Green, SNP. And so the age divide in Britain is still as big as we've ever had. So in the 1980s and the 90s, we didn't really have an age divide anywhere near what we've got now. And the age divide between younger and older voters is now enormous. So only 7% of Zoomers are planning to vote Conservative. So 7%, not even 1 in 10, are planning to vote Conservative. Now, if you put them with the Reform people, basically you can get to about 1 in 5 are voting for the right. But 4 and 5 are not. So that's a long-term structural problem facing conservatism as well.
Actually, may I have just a very brief question to follow up? I wanted to ask if you believe that the Labour Party will try to accommodate to their voters also in other areas. I mean, like foreign policy issues. We haven't talked about foreign policy here today, but I mean all that student protests on campuses, the streets in London, how do they look like with all the protests vocalizing pro-Hamas support? So do you think it may have impact on their foreign policy?
Yeah, I think Labour will come under sustained pressure to adopt a stronger anti-Israel position, to recognize Palestine, to press harder for an ongoing ceasefire. The Labour electorate is structurally unsound because they are relying on a lot of professional liberals, but also 90% of British Muslims, and an increasingly radical, cultural or woke left activist base who have very strong views on Israel-Gaza. And Keir Starmer will be able to manage that in the short term, but over the longer term, given the demographic trends in Britain, we are forecast to have the largest overall increase in Europe in the absolute number of Muslims between today and 2050. So if you look at the Pew Research Center forecasts, which are pretty, you can't say Pew Research Center is a sort of right-wing think tank. They're pretty liberal. Their forecasts say in 2050, Britain's Muslim population will be about 21, 22%, up from about 6% today. Sweden will be 31%. France will be 25 to 30%. So, the pressures on the political parties from a more sectarian politics, I think those pressures are only going to grow. We had a survey recently that suggested 40% of British Muslims would like a Muslim-only political party. We actually have an organization now called Muslim Votes, which tries to mobilize British Muslims along the lines of religion, encouraging them to vote simply along the lines of Gaza, and to lobby MPs. We've obviously had members of parliament being harassed and intimidated at their homes by radical Muslim activists and also radical left-wing organizers. So, I mean, it's becoming a serious issue. So there's a kind of loose alliance between, what I would consider to be Hamas sympathizers and supporters and radical left students and activists, and the numbers are not small. I mean, if you look at a recent survey we had, 46% of British Muslims say they openly sympathize with Hamas. and about 30% denied that there were murders and rapes on October the 7th. Like, that's nearly 1 in 3. You know, almost half of the Muslim population in Britain openly sympathizing with Hamas. That's a problem. Like, we can, you know, try and be nice about it and maybe say the survey design wasn't right, but I don't think that's true. I think it's a problem, and we need to talk about what we do about that problem. My frustration is in Britain, we can't have a mature conversation about what to do, because if you mention integration or immigration, everybody becomes very nervous about the conversation. So again, this is one of the first things Nigel Farage said on the campaign trail, is he said he's worried about the lack of integration in lots of communities in Britain. And the person who was interviewing him was Trevor Phillips, who's then said, well, Nigel, I think you're being very inflammatory. Now, Trevor Phillips has done documentaries himself on segregation in Muslim communities. In fact, he infamously said Britain was sleepwalking to segregation. But it was a very interesting example because it showed how once you become a prominent member of the media class, which Trevor has done, and he's a friend of mine, so this is not a criticism, but when you become a member of the media class, you are then drawn into this parallel conversation whereby you're not allowed to really challenge the things that you have already challenged prior to being in that media class. And Nigel was just saying what Trevor had already said in the documentary, which is we have a big problem with segregation in Britain. And even, you know, prominent Muslims have said this. Ed Hussein has said this in his book, Among the Mosques. He says, you know, you can look at some parts of England, and if you are a young British Muslim, you can spend all of your time being surrounded by other Muslims but having no interaction with the non-Muslim majority because the communities are so segregated. And even that has not really cut through, because if I were to mention that, if I were to come off this event and say something like that on Twitter or X, I would be called an Islamophobe. But what I'm saying is empirical reality, like it's empirical fact. I mean, I could take you to any number of communities in Northern England and show you what is happening. In fact, just one more example because it's fascinating. One of the biggest scandals that has happened in British society over the last 20 years has been what's called the grooming scandal, where Muslim gangs were sexually exploiting young white working class girls. And I was invited to give a talk at Oxford University about multiculturalism and some of the problems that we've been experiencing. And one of the Oxford professors said, you know, name me one negative effect of multiculturalism in this country. To which I said, well, the grooming scandal. And I was instantly met with a very hostile response from the Oxford students and professors who said, you know, firstly said, well, this is not as much of a problem as people have made out. And secondly, tried to deny that British Pakistani Muslims are disproportionately more likely to be engaging in this organized sexual exploitation. At which point I said, well, you do know one of the largest grooming rings was operating in Oxford. And Oxford had a well-documented case of an organized grooming ring that was operating in and around the Oxford area. And there is a refusal to engage with any of the evidence that challenges or undermines the diversity is positive myth. Eric Kaufman, a colleague of mine who's just written a very good book called Taboo, Eric rightly says, you know, if the problem with liberalism now is that it's become so obsessed with viewing minorities as sacred, racial, sexual, and gender minorities as sacred, that it cannot engage with cases and examples where we find minority groups are engaging in some very ugly behavior. And the grooming scandal is one of those examples.
Okay, more questions? Martin.
We keep returning to Boris Johnson and to his big win in 2019, which then came to a disappointment. I wonder if it couldn't be also rephrased in a way that some people are simply easily deceived, and it's quite possible that another charming liar will appear in a different guise and will do the same trick again. What do you think? Is it possible or not? Or to put it another way, there's supply side and there's demand side, right? There are, and I'm sure there were problems on the supply side, on the Boris side. What about the quality of the demand side?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were misled. And Boris played a very good hand at doing what he needed to do to win a majority, and there may be somebody in the future who does something similar, although I would like to think the British people have become a lot more cynical and critical of mainstream politicians as a result of the last 10 years. Look, I mean, I do think fundamentally Boris has weakened our democracy. I really do think he's undermined trust in politics. And I think he's undermined a lot of hope that people had. You know, for a lot of people, Brexit wasn't really about leaving the European Union. Brexit was about building a very different kind of Britain. And it wasn't really an exercise in withdrawal. It was an exercise in construction. And Johnson failed to deliver on all counts. And so did Dominic Cummings. And Keir Starmer will most likely fail as well. But it's the British people that I just feel sorry for, because for a lot of those people, remember, who don't usually participate in politics, they came out to vote for the Conservatives in 2019 because they felt that there was going to be a different kind of Britain. And they were let down massively.
Well, I have no stake in being a Johnson advocate, but the way I remember it, I mean, he ran on the pledge to get Brexit done, and he, as far as I'm concerned, he's delivered on that pledge. Yeah. He may not have delivered on many other things, but if you remember, and we all remember what went on before, and the total meltdown that...
I try to forget it.
Yeah, that the parliament was in. I mean, he got you out of that hole for all his failings and flaws. I think we may...
Okay, slightly going back to Labour and their, I mean, you've described it mostly as their policies are naive and for me empty oftentimes that they're proposing, and still they've been able to somewhat not fall into the trap of the many scandals that Tories have endured in the past few years. So some people also suggest that it's not Tories fragmenting and some of them going more to the center. Some people are suggesting it's the opposite, that Labour are going more in the center, and then that Starmer is running on being pragmatic and trying to reach the middle somehow. I know that, as you mentioned, by-elections and those data are not really suggesting that Labour is gaining that much. But still, do you think there's something to the suggestion that Labour is also gaining by being less leftist than they used to?
Yeah, but again, to go back to the previous question, it's, do you believe Keir Starmer, right? That's the kind of question hanging over this election, because, this is the guy that told us to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister twice. This is a guy that said when we voted for Brexit, you should have another referendum and change your mind. I mean, Starmer's record is actually quite radical. There is a view that if you look at his front bench, Angela Rayner, David Lammy, these people are have been consistently radical in opposition. What's going to happen with a big majority? I suspect all the things I talked about. Immigration will go even higher. The woke stuff will be mainstreamed. Sectarianism will become more embedded. Identity politics will become a more regular feature of British life. If you want an example, go and look at Labour's Racial Equality Act, which is going to distribute government contracts on the basis of race and ethnicity. You know, importing America-style diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks. That will all happen at the same time as there'll be a push to adopt a stronger anti-Israel position. Yes, to get closer to the European Union, potentially over the next 10 years to re-enter, potentially. It will start with things like, let's cozy up on the Europe Defence Pact, let's do some more to, help students, let's maybe flirt with the customs union or something. But eventually, there is a big desire among the Labour rank and file to rejoin the European Union. So I think, if Starmer is able to hold it all together, but that's an enormous if, because he's got to hold the left, he's got to hold the minority votes, he's got to hold the students, he's got to hold the professional liberals. Not an easy job. Let's see.
How about Ukraine? We have to ask that question here. What are the Labour government policies likely to be on that?
In theory, sustain the status quo. Keep supporting Ukraine, keep providing arms, don't talk about where it's all going, just keep kind of funding and sustaining. But I think, at some point somebody's going to have a, conversation about what the end outcome is going to be and what that's going to look like. I suspect that will be forced on all of us by the outcome of the US presidential election. I suspect when we get to the autumn, there will be somebody saying, this is how it's going to end, and they'll try and force that conversation. But Labour are not going to deviate from the current direction of travel on Ukraine. But they will, I suspect, deviate or try to over the longer term with regards to Israel and Palestine. I think there will be a much stronger push on Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership to meet the demands of Labour voters on that issue.
Last brief. Can you hypothetically imagine a meeting of Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his cooperation and communication with President of the United States, Donald Trump? How would that work?
Well, those conversations are already happening. There are trade discussions happening. Keir Starmer, I suspect would like to be the Prime Minister signing a trade deal with the United States. I think that would make him look how he wants to look among moderate voters in the middle. Of course, there's going to be skepticism about Trump and working with Trump, but there are already conversations underway between Labour and the Republicans. And maybe, maybe Starmer will use that to try and project his image as a pragmatist. I think it's too early to say, but it would be a big coup for him.
Is he likely to use the special relationship rhetorics at all?
Of course, we always use that. Of course, it's a special relationship. It's a relationship that goes one way, but special nonetheless.